All right, it is time to go over Unit 2, which covers the years from 1607 to 1754. Now, those dates are significant because 1607 is the year that Jamestown is founded, so it's the beginning of the British Empire in North America, and 1754 is the beginning of the French and Indian War. So we have two kind of book-ending events there that all of this occurs between. So first, let's talk about the political history. So, in American history, we have examples of representative government from the very beginning of our nation. When the Pilgrims first arrived, they formed the Mayflower Compact, and they say, whatever the group decides is best, whatever we vote for, that is what our colony will do. So, from the very beginning, they have a very democratic way of doing things. In Virginia, meanwhile, they had the House of Burgesses that they established really early. This meant that they would elect people from their colony to make decisions as far as taxation, how that money would be spent, how they would fund the military or defense. And so you have from the very beginning of American history examples of representative government. And it makes sense later on why we fight so hard to hold on to that representation. As far as religion as it pertains to politics, you have men like Roger Williams fighting against the strict control of those who are running the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They refused to allow a tolerance for other ways of doing things, and they also didn't exactly treat Native Americans with the most respect. So Roger Williams is forced to leave for freedom of religion, and that shows that religion is going to be a divisive thing sometimes in American history. And then you have Anne Hutchinson, a woman who challenges the leadership of the church there in Massachusetts Bay Colony. She is kicked out because she challenges their leadership and teaches different things, and partially because she is a female challenging their leadership. And so, again, we have division over, even though we claim there's freedom of religion, it's clear that religion could be divisive and used as a political weapon or cause divisions. Then you have church leaders controlling Massachusetts Bay. So, yeah, they took care of Roger Williams and Hutchinson, forcing them to leave. But in Massachusetts Bay, you also only saw church members being able to vote. And those are specific people who had been baptized and had a visible experience with God. And so they were able to keep political control and be able to limit who could have political power by only allowing members of the church to vote. Then you have a theme of rich versus poor. In the North, you have merchants, like in New York City. Merchants ran everything and made all the decisions because they had the money. But the most famous example is in Virginia, where we have Nathaniel Bacon leading farmers who had been forced onto the frontier as indentured servants came to America and were forced onto the frontier in this cheap land or may not get land at all. They come into conflict with Native Americans. These poor farmers demand that plantation owners, through the House of Burgesses, help defend them. When the Governor Berkeley refuses to help them out, Nathaniel Bacon rallies these indentured servants and poor or former indentured servants and poor farmers against them, and this causes some massive changes, which we'll talk about in the African American section. But that shows that rich versus poor is a theme in this time period. Then you have Dominion of New England. What it resembles is England trying to control their colonies, even though they allowed in many cases, the colonies to rule themselves and make decisions as far as their taxation. Every once in a while, they would try to exert more control over them. This is most evident in the Dominion of New England when they force all of the northern colonies and the New England colonies together under the might of Edmund Andros. Basically, they removed their ability to worship how they wanted by forcing them into Anglican churches. They got rid of their representative bodies, and this upset the people who lived there because, as you can tell from the politics above, religion and representative government is what was most important to them. So when England has what we call the Glorious Revolution and their king is overthrown, this begins an era of salutary neglect. The Dominion of New England crumbles after the new rulers come in, William and Mary, and salutary neglect is where England allows the colonies to do whatever they want as far as trade and as far as religion, as long as they are being profitable to England. And so this period of salutary neglect will last all the way until the end of the French and Indian War. And when it goes away and they start trying to control the colonies again after nearly a century of allowing that to happen, Well, the colonists are going to be quite upset. That's more of a Unit 3 thing, however. And then you have the John Peter Zenger trial, the first man to defend free speech in the colonies when the governor was doing some corrupt things and was being accused of it by John Peter Zenger. He is put on trial for questioning the governor and printing true stories. And the governor tries to say that he can't print negative stories about him as a government figure. So when he defends successfully himself in court, this sets the precedent in America that free speech will be defended. So this brings us to the next category, which is foreign policy. And now, again, there is no U.S. in this time period, so foreign policy is a little not exactly accurate. So we're just going to talk about how all the different nations related to what would eventually become America through the English. So there's many different groups who come and settle in the New World. That includes the Spanish, the French, the English, and the Dutch. There are 4 major European settlers, and all of them are competing in America for land. The English themselves focus primarily on cash crops. You think of tobacco in the southern colonies. Eventually, it will turn into cotton after the colonial period, but the English focus primarily on cash crops and on natural resources that were more agriculture based. The French, meanwhile, expanded their trade network and expanded their French Canada through the beaver fur trade, which was also really lucrative. And you see the French go across the entire continent, connecting all of their beaver fur trade market together. The Spanish, meanwhile, had more settled into the southern areas below the modern United States. And they had built their empire centuries ago, and they really didn't expand upon that much more. As far as what the overall foreign policy, how did these nations relate to their colonies? It all comes back to the idea of mercantilism. So, mercantilism is the idea that you need to hold more gold, and gold is where all the power is and all the economic power. And so, when they looked at the idea of colonies, they didn't view them as extensions of their own nation, but rather areas that were going to feed into them getting more gold. The colonies were purely there for their financial benefit, not for anything else. And so, what that causes nations like England to do with their colonies, as you saw above the Dominion of New England, it caused them to not view them as having the rights of Englishmen, rather just a place where they deserved, or all they needed to do was make England money. So they wanted to control and restrict trade, and they did that through acts like the Navigation Acts and Molasses Act. What that did was they could only trade with England. They could not trade with other rivals like the French, like the Spanish. This forces the colonists to smuggle, and eventually the colonists do so much smuggling and getting around to it. That's why salutary neglect goes into action. It's because colonists were getting around it and causing friction. So England decides, you know what, how about you just keep making money, and as long as we make money as well, you can ignore the Navigation Acts and the Molasses Act. Going into Unit 3, when salutary neglect ends, that's why it's such a big deal, is England had not been enforcing those laws, and so that creates conflict after a century of saying, hey, you don't have to, you can trade with whoever you want as long as we're all making money. And then you have the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment and the push for natural rights causes colonists to resist the control of those mother or father nations. We'll touch more on the Enlightenment when it comes to causes of the creation of America in Unit 3. So then we get into economics. We've already talked about mercantilism and how that kind of shaped how the European powers viewed the world, that we were there to provide the mother nation with natural resources. Now that brings us to the Triangle Trade Route. We see Europe being the destination where the Triangle Trade Route begins. They have manufactured products. They sell those manufactured products to Africa, where they sell them for slaves. Those slaves are then brought over to the New World. Those slaves would be used and sold to the areas in the New World for the natural resources that the New World had in abundance. And they go from the New World of the Americas back to England or back to Europe with those natural resources so they can manufacture more products. So this was a lucrative triangle trade route which made them a lot of money. You have manufactured goods in Europe, you have slaves in Africa, and you have natural resources in the New World. Colonies existed to benefit the mother countries, as I touched on with mercantilism above, the Navigation Act and Molasses Act as well. We could only trade with them. And then the next line again is touching on that triangle trade route. So what about the actual American colonies or the British colonies? The New England colonies, the 4 toward the north, New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay Colony. Goodness gracious, I haven't gone over these in a long time. Vermont, those in Connecticut, those are going to focus on shipping, lumber, and fishing. They are kind of, they don't have the soil there to have agriculture like the others do. And so they focus more on collecting things and shipping and selling things to make their money. As far as the South focused on tobacco and other crops. You had Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. They also were very dependent upon slave labor. First, indentured servants and then slaves. But so the South is very much focused on cash crops. And then the middle colonies are a mix of both. They have really good trade, but they also have a lot of farmland. Instead of focusing on cash crops, they instead focus on crops that feed the other colonies. And so each region has their own purpose and their own reason or their own economic way of doing things. And then you have labor, which I just touched on. We will touch again on the African Americans. But most of the labor came from indentured servants. The English did not use Native Americans. They did not trust them and did not want them to be part of their society. And so first they brought over indentured servants. And you have things like the Headright Act in Virginia, which gave already farmer or landowners 50 additional acres for every servant you brought over. And they would be the labor force to help them make money. The problem is as we touched on in Bacon's Rebellion, those indentured servants did not exactly appreciate being controlled. And so they fought against the powerful plantation owners because they weren't followed through with their promises and they weren't being protected from Native Americans. They were being given land, etc. And so after Bacon's Rebellion, you see those plantation owners and the powerful figures in the South move away from indentured servants and instead start purchasing African slaves, and they become the dominant labor force. So what about religion? Religion has a massive impact on American culture from the beginning. Now, it's not the reason for settling everywhere. Going back to economics, the first reason why we settle in the New World, as far as the English are concerned, is for they try to find gold through the Virginia Company. So when Jamestown's created to try to find gold. The New England region, however, is settled solely for religious freedom or escaping religious persecution. So Puritans try to create what they called a city on a hill in Massachusetts and Connecticut. If you remember the name John Winthrop, he's the one who gives the speech about the city on a hill, that they're going to be a model Christian society that the rest of the world will look toward. That is what a Christian society should look like. The issue is that their religious freedom, as you saw with Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, it was only the religious freedom for how they wanted religion to be practiced. So if anyone challenged their way of doing things in Massachusetts, Connecticut, then they would be kicked out. And that's why Rhode Island's created by Roger Williams. And I just now remembered that I said Vermont, and that was wrong. It was actually Rhode Island, not Vermont, in the New England region. Sorry. Hey, I haven't gone over this in months, so you should be happy regardless. Maryland Act of Toleration. So why was Maryland created in the South? Unlike the other colonies made purely for money, a guy named Lord Baltimore wants all of his Catholic buddies to have a place to go and have their plantations and make a lot of money, but also they want protection because Catholics weren't exactly welcomed back in England. And so they have to end up passing the Act of Toleration because after they create their colony, all of their indentured servants and workers were Protestant, and they try to get rid of Catholicism. So the Act of Toleration accepts all Christians in Maryland and provides protection for Catholics. One of the few times you see that happen in early American history. So again, religion being a big part of why Maryland was created and part of their culture in trying to tolerate all Christian religions. Rhode Island and Pennsylvania were known for their religious tolerance. Shouldn't surprise you that Rhode Island, created by Roger Williams, who wanted tolerance for all religions and freedom of religion from the state. So the state could not tax people to pay for a specific church. So then you have Pennsylvania, founded by Penn, who was a Quaker. And since Quakers were persecuted everywhere and viewed as different and strange, he wanted a place where all groups could be tolerated, including his own, the Quakers. So Pennsylvania is also known for its religious tolerance. And in general, that is something the middle colonies were also known for. Then you have the First Great Awakening. In the 1730s and 40s, we have men like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards preaches the sermon Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and George Whitefield tries to raise money. But both of them challenged traditional church authority. They preached in ways that were not just reading the Bible to people. Look at how much I know about the Bible. Instead, they used emotion. And they used the feelings that people had to convert to Christianity and to keep them, I guess, attached to the church and attending. And so they increased church membership. The problem is that you have the old people who do not like exactly how this is being done. And so this creates a conflict between old and new lights, as they called it. And then finally, the challenging of church authority leads to the challenging of political authority. So some people see the First Great Awakening as a reason why we have the revolution. So, moving on to women in the early or in this colonial period. We already touched on Anne Hutchinson, how Anne Hutchinson challenged Massachusetts Bay leadership and John Winthrop specifically. She is kicked out because she challenges their way of doing things, and women just weren't supposed to be doing that in their minds. So let's talk about the role specifically for women in the two most different regions of the colonies. You have New England and you have the South. In New England, once a woman was married, she ceased to exist legally. She could not own property. She was just expected to be a mother, to care for the children, to manage the home, to make sure that they have Christian values. Women, for the most part, were just meant to be the helper for the man, taking care of the house. So women did not have many rights in New England. In the South, although women weren't exactly equal, because of the high death rate, women were allowed to own land and thus were given a bit more equality because of it. So because men died so frequently, and this would mean property and children would go into a state of not being owned or controlled by anybody, women were given more equality. Regardless, you can see in both those situations, women aren't equal. And so women are going to have to continue fighting for their equality as years pass. As far as African Americans, when did they come to America? The first slave boat actually arrives in 1619. So when African Americans first arrive and the slave trade is increasing, we actually see African Americans coming because natives simply weren't good workers. And this first begins with the Spanish in the Caribbean and then eventually extends into North America with the British. So slavery at first was quite different. They used to have the ability to get manumission, or they could earn enough money to pay off the debt that they'd been purchased by and get their freedom. Manumission is where the owner would grant them freedom after a specific amount of time, or at least just give them their freedom because maybe they felt guilty. But at first, African Americans were not viewed specifically as slaves. Over time, however, slavery and the view towards African Americans changed. So first we have Bacon's Rebellion, which causes indentured servitude to end. So rather than just having some slaves, instead slaves became the predominant labor force in America. Furthermore, as slaves began getting frustrated with being owned for life, you see them begin to resist their control. And so in the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, a group of slaves rebel and kill many of the people around them as they try to flee towards Spanish Florida. Before they get there, they are captured and put to death. And the main effect of the Stono Rebellion is that South Carolina and other surrounding plantation owners and slave owners realize that they have to put more restrictions on slaves if they're going to control them. And so we see an increase on the restrictions of slaves. And a lot of these ideas came from, if you'll remember, the Barbados Slave Code. The Spanish were the first to face these massive insurrections. And so in the Barbados and other Caribbean islands, the Spanish and British owners there had begun passing laws restricting the ability of slaves to have freedoms. Also, if you remember, the main Barbados Slave Code was that they could actually kill a slave if he was bad enough without any fear of legal issues. And so with the Stono Rebellion, we see that Barbados Slave Code being used in America and restricting the freedom of slaves. Furthermore, what causes America to depend more and more on slaves is the creation of cash crops. Tobacco had been a very popular product, and in South Carolina, you also have rice and indigo. But with the South depending on cash crops as their primary economic item, they need a large labor force. And so all these events unfortunately mean that African Americans become more and more viewed as slaves and eternal slaves. The idea is called chattel. They are cattle or they are property. Sadly, slavery moves towards that status that you think of in the pre-Civil War era. That brings us to Native Americans. So Native Americans are not accepted by the British, whereas the French traded with them, married them, formed alliances with them. The Spanish did the same, eventually welcoming them into their society as a group called mestizos, which is a mix of European and Native heritage. The British, meanwhile, try to completely alienate and isolate them. They're willing to let them live outside of their cities, but they cannot marry and they do not mingle. And so, as they move to America and their colonies expand, they constantly push the natives further west. As they are infringing on these natives' land, they are also forcing any Indians they interact with to adopt English names, to live in Indian towns or praying villages where they had to accept Christianity and kind of become assimilated to the way the English wanted them. Regardless, they still didn't let them live in their villages with them, but they did let them adopt a little bit of their culture. So with this in mind, in New England, you'll probably remember Squanto and Massasoit and all these positive relationships that the Pilgrims had in what we would call Thanksgiving. And eventually, that relationship erodes because of the constant pressure to change their culture and to take their land from them. And so Metacom, also known as King Philip in 1675, rebels against that relationship and fights against the infringement and conversion of his people. Sadly, he is defeated and put to death, and that is just kind of the theme for Native Americans throughout this entire time period. Indians were defeated and pushed further west, allowing the English to expand further west. And the same thing happened in the southern colonies with the Powhatan Confederacy. They're defeated by Virginia and pushed further west. And the same thing happens in the Carolinas, and the same thing happens in the middle colonies. A constant fight for Native Americans to be pushed further and further out of the English way because they refuse to accept them. So why are the Indians not being used as slaves? Their death rate was too high and they're able to escape. And so there is no real way that the British were willing to accept the Native Americans into their culture, not even as laborers or slaves. So they are viewed as an obstacle in the expansion of the British colonies. So what about immigration and migration? Three nations lead the settlement of the New World: Britain, France, and Spain. You also have the Netherlands or the Dutch. That is actually where we get New York from. The British, when they get here, are settled by different groups. In New England, you have the religious pilgrims, you have the Puritans. Religion ran their region. Then you have the plantation owners who move into the South. You have groups like Lord Baltimore. You have the 8 Lord Proprietors in the Carolinas, and Oglethorpe was a powerful figure who helps found Georgia. And they create a plantation economy, and the rest of their settlers are primarily brought over as indentured servants. And of course, as we discussed, those indentured servants will later be replaced by slaves. So what about the middle colonies? Who are they settled by the British? Well, they are a mix of many different groups. First of all, Delaware and New York were initially settled by other nations, the Swedish and the Dutch. They welcome different religions, the Jews, the Quakers in the middle colonies as well. And so the middle colonies is harder to specify exactly who settles it because they are from the beginning kind of a melting pot. So overall, those are the migration and immigration patterns. I guess one thing we could add is the constant westward migration of the British, putting pressure on Native Americans and pushing them out of their way. And then finally, we have technology. What kind of technology or innovations lead to large changes in the colonies or in world and American history? John Rolfe, he is able to create tobacco as a cash crop. He figures out how to grow it there, and it revolutionizes the Southern economy, and it makes a lot of money for Britain and the South. And so the Southern colonies commit themselves to the cash crop economy. Sadly, that also means, well, that we will commit ourselves in the South to the slave plantation economy as well. Then you have triangular trade. This new innovation allowed colonies to gather natural resources for the manufacturing of Europe and make everyone a lot of money. Sadly, Africa, the third part of that triangle, is not treated well as they become a source of labor and not really engaged in the meaningful trade of resources or manufactured products. Okay, so I know that this takes a long time, and if you're listening to the whole thing, it probably is a little bit overwhelming, but there's some good information here. Now, there may be things that I missed or that you could add. Feel free to let me know if there is something you see that you think I missed or that is necessary. If you're going through the review book, you'll also probably see a lot of other details that could be added. Let me know about that as well. You always need to seek other sources besides just my word of mouth reviews. Now, while I think the majority of the main items are covered in this review, there will be details that I can't cover. I can't talk for 30 hours nor study and recite all the history books. But this is a really good start for you in your review. And I think if you know all the items on here, you will do quite well for anything based on Unit 2 in the AP test. Okay, that is it. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Tomorrow will be Unit 3. Have a great day.